In my presentation, I am going to be focusing on women and womanhood in Jane Austen's Persuasion. In her essay, The Vindication of the Rights of Woman, Mary Wollstonecraft states that the following: "The civilized women of the present century, with a few exceptions, are only anxious to inspire love, when they ought to cherish a nobler ambition, and by their abilities and virtues exact respect." It is this quote that will be used as the basis of the following presentation, as Wollstonecraft was particularly outspoken in regards to the subject of women and their roles within society during her time. A writer that has a specific interest in the role of the woman, both in terms of romance and position within the household and society, is Jane Austen. Her last novel, Persuasion, is often viewed as her most mature book, as Anne Elliot is the oldest of any of her heroines. With age comes more experience, responsibility, and expectations. Therefore, would it be fair to say that Persuasion is simply a romance novel? Or would readers such as Wollstonecraft find it to be a feminist approach to tackling issues of her time, for example, issues such as class structures in society, particularly in relation to the role of women and what is expected of them? Perhaps the best place to begin when exploring the idea of womanhood during Austen's lifetime would be to look at representations of women often seen within the Romantic period, therefore gauging ideas Austen would have likely been exposed to. The Romantic period is well known for its deep interest in the subject of nature and all that is natural, and whilst many writers, Wordsworth for example, focused on the environment around them, there are several other branches that were touched upon in a much more subtle manner, such as individuality, freedom, and the idealized woman, all of which can be found in Austen's own work. Of course, despite the rather quaint idea of freedom and individuality, it was also a time of great conflict, and was therefore a period of strong ideals surrounding war and masculinity. Anne Mellor wrote that there are two forms of romanticism, masculine and feminine, implying that despite male writers being much more in touch with their emotions, something that was considered typically female, there was still a ever-present gender divide found within texts of the period. Stephen Greenblatt points out that an interesting development of the time was that people were much readier to accept that the work of female writers helped make this exciting period what it was. As with more female writers came a rise in women addressing the issues they as a sex faced. Of course, this meant that a much more accurate representation of a woman's life was being presented, as opposed to what had often been happening, which was men basing his beliefs on observation and assumption instead of first-hand experience. Diane Long Hoover believed this was a highly positive advancement, writing that women lived through the same historical and cultural events that men did, but they refracted those events in a very different modes of literary production. As anyone who has read Austen's novels will know, they often focus on the theme of love and ultimately marriage. Whether readers are being swept away, or sometimes even deeply irritated by the aloofness of Mr. Darcy, or infuriated by Aunt Elliot and Mr. Wentworth's refusal to admit their true feelings, it cannot be denied that Austen possesses a great talent for constructing compelling and interesting love stories. Wollstonecraft, on the other hand, wasn't as keen to explore the idea of marriage, and if she did, it was often with contempt. In her essay, A Feminist Connection, Miriam Ascarelli describes Wollstonecraft as being famous for her contempt of marriage, so it would certainly be interesting to see what Wollstonecraft would have to say about Austen, a woman who focused on this aspect of a woman's life. Of course, given the changes happening within society at the time Austen was writing, it's understandable that she would be heavily influenced by said changes, with them ultimately weaving their way into her work. With the Romantic period came a change in the way society approached marriage, as it became a lot less about finance and a lot more about emotions and sensibility. What's particularly interesting about Austen's work is that, although she writes about passion and love, she doesn't ignore the pressures many members of the upper classes faced in regards to marriage and suitable partners. Here we see Anne torn in a dilemma that many women of the time faced. Do they choose love or position? And during a time when status can change so quickly, as seen in the case of Mr. Wentworth, it is likely to have been confusing for women when it came to deciding who was suitable for both their families and her ultimate happiness. So the quote is as follows: "She felt a great deal of goodwill towards him. In spite of the mischief of his attentions, she owed him gratitude and regard, perhaps compassion. She could not help thinking much of the extraordinary circumstances attending their acquaintance, of the right which he seemed to interest her by everything in situation, by his own sentiments, by his early prepossession. It was altogether very extraordinary, flattering but painful. There was much to regret. How she might have felt had there been no Captain Wentworth in the case was not worth inquiry, for there was a Captain Wentworth, and be the conclusion of the present suspense good or bad, her affection would be his forever. Their union, she believed, could not divide her more from other men than their final separation." Now that quote perfectly summarises the difficult decision that Anne is faced. Should it be down to her own personal feelings, there is no competition, as she makes it clear time and time again that Mr. Wentworth has her heart. However, she doesn't fail to recognise that on paper Mr. Elliot is a perfect match both in terms of family and social standing. Critic Julia Brown comments on the fact that despite it being an issue of her time, Austen has come under considerable criticism from feminist readers, given that all of her novels end in the marriage of her heroine and their love interest. With Anne Elliot, despite being the most mature of her female leads and having been exposed to the downfalls of marriage, being no exception. Many critics have speculated that Austen uses her novels as a way of covertly making fun of the assumptions made about women within both society and literature. And given the fact that Austen's heroines are often rather witty and humorous on the subject of marriage, it's understandable why some would think this. An example of Austen using wit as a way of laughing at society comes from Elizabeth Bennet in Pride and Prejudice, when she states that "a lady's imagination is very rapid. It jumps from admiration to love, from matrimony in a moment." Of course, it's quite clear that this is not only completely untrue, but a huge generalisation of women as a whole, and it would seem highly unlikely for Austen to include it in her novel as an honest representation of what she believes women to be like. Further evidence that Austen found the expectations of women in marriage to be ridiculous come in the form of Love and Friendship, a parody-style story based on the romantic novels that Austen read whilst growing up. It's thought that she wrote the epistolary-style tales simply for the amusement of her family. However, it's clear to see that even at such a young age, as she was writing the story between 11 and 18, she was highly opinionated when it came to women in literature. On the subject of her earlier work, Lynn Peckett wrote that Austen's published works are prized for their careful plotting and their stylistic restraint, whilst the tales she wrote as a young girl are energetic and full of private jokes and anarchic humour. So, what changed? A possible explanation could be that it was simply the process of growing up that forced Austen to realise that, as a recognised writer, she couldn't be as carefree with what was included in her novels as she had been as a child writing for just her family. As with more attention came more responsibility. As a side note, it's interesting to consider the similarities between Austen and her character Anne Elliot, who both feel a greater amount of responsibility the older they get, which in turn greatly influences their decisions in life. But just because Austen isn't as open and honest in her writing anymore, does that make her any less of a feminist writer? And is she even being dishonest? After all, opinions do change with time. It could be argued, however, that it is her careful wording that makes her a highly intelligent writer, who is still very much a feminist, as she is masking hard truths behind gentle prose and idealistic romance, asking the reader to explore her meaning beyond the surface. Austen appears to support this way of thinking, writing in Northanger Abbey that a woman, especially if she has the misfortune of knowing anything, should conceal it as well as she can. On the subject of women knowing anything, I want to discuss the idea of women's education in relation to a woman's place within society at the time Austen was writing. Both of the Austen sisters attended schools, however, spent a lot of their education being homeschooled instead. The theme of education is addressed in several of Austen's novels, one of which being Mansfield Park, where she writes that give a girl an education and introduce her properly to the world. It could be argued that Austen believes the girl should have the best of both worlds, and that a girl should be entitled to an education in order to expand her horizons intellectually, in turn having an easier transition into society, something that was highly important to people in her time, especially those of the upper classes. In Persuasion, Anne is Austen's oldest heroine, so we don't get to see much to do with her education. However, that doesn't mean we shouldn't discount the other influences and lessons learnt in her life. Instead, we could focus on her mentors instead of her teachers, two of the most prominent being her father, Sir Walter, and Lady Russell, who both proved to be more problematic than helpful. In her essay, Anne Elliot's Education, The Learning of Romance in Persuasion, Anne Astel claims that if Anne Elliot has suffered and continues to suffer without becoming embittered, it is because she has found a way to supply the need for a mentor within her own consciousness, implying that she believes Anne to rely on herself for her own intellect and self-education rather than taking the advice of those around her as she did in the past. Astel goes on to write that Austen consistently describes Anne's struggle with her emotions as an educational process that is triggered by the events she experienced, an idea that makes a lot of sense, as experience will have meant that Anne has learnt to trust her own instinct, which is an educational lesson in its own right, for intellect of one's own sense of character can be as invaluable as that of the more traditional subjects. Wollstonecraft was highly interested in women's education, as shown in her essay, Vindication of the Rights of Woman, as she believes that women were educated to a lesser degree than men, and for this she blames the opposite sex. She wrote that male writers who looked at female education only succeeded in portraying women as artificial and weak and overall useless members of society. Whilst this may seem quite harsh, it's worth remembering that Wollstonecraft was writing from a female perspective, with experience in their prejudices towards men, and therefore has a more reliable position to comment on the matter of female education than of those she may be referring to here. Today, equality is a highly current, important topic, but it isn't only recently that people have begun challenging the issues men and women face in trying to reach some kind of level footing. Austen approaches the subject of equality in Persuasion, writing that, I do not think I ever opened a book in my life which had not something to say upon women's inconsistency. Songs and proverbs all talk of women's fickleness, but perhaps you will say these were all written by men. If you please, no reference to examples in books. Men have had every advantage of us in telling their own story. Education has been theirs in so much higher a degree. The pen has been in their hands. Here, Austen is clearly concerned with the ways in which women were being represented by men in literature, and uses the conversation between Anne and Captain Harville as a tool. She seems to believe that there is a correlation between equality and the lack of female education to the same standards as men. And if we consider Austen's point of women having a proper education enables them to experience the world properly, the extent of her frustrations becomes quite evident. However, just because women weren't getting an education to the same standard as men, it didn't mean they weren't striving to better themselves and have ambitions. As previously mentioned, Wollstonecraft was strongly spoken in her plight for women's rights, and is described by Miriam Ascarelli as an indefatigable advocate of what was then an even more radical idea, the idea that women, like men, were rational creatures. Now it seems silly that people would believe women couldn't be rational, but during the Romantic period women were believed to be much more emotional than men, and therefore couldn't be trusted to approach an issue with a level head, something that understandably infuriated Wollstonecraft. Despite the evidence shown throughout this presentation, there were critics that claimed Austen's work went against feminist ideas, given how so many novels focus on a woman securing a husband. However, Ascarelli disagrees, writing that, like Wollstonecraft, Austen was a formidable feminist critic, and that although she writes in a gentle tone, she was clearly influenced by a prominent issue of her time, which was, of course, women's roles within society and expanding on the role of women and domesticity. In fact, Austen touches upon something Ascarelli believed Wollstonecraft did, women's rationality in relation to their ambitions. In Persuasion, in a conversation between Mrs. Croft and Wentworth, she comments that, "I hate to hear you talking so, like a fine gentleman, as if women were all fine ladies instead of rational creatures. We none of us expect to be in smooth waters all our days." From this conversation, we can see that Austen feels as though women are stereotyped and grouped together based on assumptions depending on their social standing. It appears that she is speaking on behalf of all women, given the fact that she uses the inclusive term of none of us, and that overall, women seek the excitement in life they often hear of men having, perhaps either from word of mouth or in the male written books they read. Many critics believe Persuasion to be one of Austen's most scathing attacks on society at the time, and, according to Olivia Murphy, that it was proof of her fading powers, of her sickness, her bitterness, her insularity from the great cultural and historic movements of the day. However, is Austen's increasing lack of subtlety necessarily a bad thing? For it is possible that in her impending death she was simply refusing to sugarcoat cultural issues and returning to her roots, writing with a type of honesty similar to what we discovered in the stories she wrote as a child. I thought it would be interesting to return to the initial catalyst for this presentation and explore whether or not we, as a modern reader, would still agree on this statement. Whilst many praise Wollstonecraft for being highly progressive in her ideas, I can't help but find this statement problematic. Could it be that Wollstonecraft intended for the statement to come across as problematic as a way of inspiring women to do all they can for themselves and take control of their own lives without the influence of men? In summary, I'd like the following to be considered. Is Wollstonecraft limiting women instead of empowering them, or is she deliberately trying to get a response from both writers and readers of the time? And going back to criticism of Austen, Marilyn Butler states in Jane Austen in The War of Ambitions that Austen was a conservative propagandist because all her heroines got married, implicitly endorsing the established social order. However, if women do have anxieties concerning marriage, is this the fault of society's expectations instead of lack of ambition? Evidence shows that Austen uses irony and sarcasm to show this at several points within her novels. So, is it fair to say that she is influenced by feminist ideas? Persuasion is noted not only for being her last completed novel, but arguably the novel that critiques society the most. Personally, I feel that although I do admire Wollstonecraft for speaking out at a time when it wasn't always easy to do so, I equally admire Austen, a woman who I believe used her platform as a way of masking controversial ideas behind witty characters and entertaining plot lines. After all, if a plot is interesting, more people are going to want to pick it up, ultimately meaning the message is spreading to a greater number of people. Thank you.